Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CG podcast, where we explore the legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic on science, society, and public health policy. I'm excited to have our guest, Tara Henley, today, who's a well-known Canadian writer and broadcaster who worked for the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, for many years. And her work has been featured in over a dozen publications worldwide. Since leaving the CBC in 2022, she's been a vocal critic of the mainstream Canadian media landscape. She has a current affairs podcast, Lean Out, focused on heterodox thinkers and writers. I've actually been a guest on her show twice during the pandemic in 2022 and again this year. So this time our roles are slightly reversed. The reason I asked Tara to join us is that this month she published the 2024 Massey Essay in the Literary Review of Canada, which is kind of a big deal. It's one of the longest essay that's critical or can be critical of the journalistic establishment in Canada, which many people are quite concerned about around the world. And the piece was titled The Trust Spiral, Restoring Faith in the Media. So welcome to the podcast, Tara.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here with you.
So to get us started, this title, right? I'm always interested in titles. Trust Spiral. What led you to kind of choose that or end on that title?
So the title came about with discussions between myself and my editor, Kyle Wyatt, at the Literary Review of Canada. And basically what we were discussing, we were at lunch one day and we were discussing what was happening in the media. And there was a report from Reuters out sometime back that showed that trust in the media in Canada had reached its lowest point in 7 years. And we were starting to see media leadership try to explain that trend in public. And I really felt that those explanations were missing the mark. You mentioned that I had been at CBC. I left CBC quite publicly several years ago. And since I left the CBC and my kind of open letter of resignation went viral, I've been getting a lot of mail from the public on a pretty regular basis. And so I had a sense of what the public was thinking, and I had a sense of what the media leadership was thinking, and there just seemed to be this big gap. And so I was trying to think. You mentioned my podcast, Lean Out. I've interviewed a lot of journalists over the last couple of years, just really trying to get at what has gone wrong with the media and how might we get back on track. And so the idea of a trust spiral was a way of explaining what has gone wrong, because it's a very multifaceted and kind of complex set of circumstances that we now deal with. And I wanted to try and look at it in a holistic way, gather the thinking of a lot of people in one place and give readers a framework for trying to understand this crisis that we're in right now. So there's a bunch of stages to the spiral. We can go into those, but it was basically like a holistic attempt to explain what's going on right now.
Yeah, and I think you've succeeded. I think I called it a forensic analysis. I could also say it was brutally honest. Okay, a couple questions there, but first, could you just give us an overview of what is the trust spiral? How many layers are there to it that you outline in the essay?
Yeah, so I focus the kickoff point leading up to the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And so what you saw leading up to Election Day was a real shift in thinking about journalism and journalists' role in society. And it was happening quite publicly. It was happening in places like the Columbia Journalism Review and the New York Times. And you know, for a period, Trump, of course, was a ratings boon for the media. But at a certain point, it started to switch. And there began to be real concerns about some of the outlandish claims that he made and the way that he dominated the news cycle with these claims. And as well, his kind of propensity for attacking the press verbally was really starting to grate. And so there started to be this sense that this was an extraordinary candidate and that ordinary journalism was just not going to cut it for covering him. And you began to see people like Jim Rettenberg in the New York Times arguing that it was time to set aside some of our dispassion, set aside some of our objectivity, if you will,
Mm.
and really understand that this was a crisis to democracy and that we needed
Right.
to be more oppositional than we had ever contemplated being. Now, I'm speaking specifically about the news side here. I'm not talking about opinion. And so that was a real turning point. And I argue in the essay that it triggered a kind of panic in the media and a pulling down of guardrails, and that guardrails, of course, exist for a reason, and that this came with unintended consequences. And so none of this would have been possible if we weren't already in such an incredibly economically precarious position as an industry. And so that really, the first stage of the trust spiral is this sort of crazy economic situation in which basically the internet broke the business model for journalism, for news, right? That advertising model was kind of decimated and news was left scrambling, trying to find a viable model. And in the wake of that, all kinds of things happened. You saw, for example, journalists having way less training than they used to. Those old norms and practices are not being passed along in the same way. With the closure of local news outlets, you saw an end to the sort of career path where you could start at these small outlets and apprentice, and gain training, and then end up in somewhere like Ottawa or Washington, where you'd already been covering stories for many years and knew how the courts worked and knew all of that stuff. But you also saw a real concentration geographically of the media. And so before, it was much more just dispersed over the countries. I'm talking now about the US and Canada. But because of the financial collapse, you saw a lot of consolidation. And now many of the journalists are in pretty expensive urban cities, which happen to have the same sort of ethos most of the time. But you also saw a shift in class background of the journalists. So journalism used to be kind of a blue collar profession. And now with the shrinking opportunities, there's a real kind of competition, a credentialism, and you're seeing very highly educated people enter the profession, often with multiple degrees, and who can do that, right? Who can work for these crumbling outlets that pay very little. It's people who come from financially well-off backgrounds. So that's the background, is that individual journalists live very economically precarious lives, and our institutions are very economically precarious. And so with that, then you have this sort of new model that came up that was the engagement model. You had a lot of private capital that was funding these outlets. It's much cheaper to write kind of outraged opinion pieces and listicles and that type of thing than it is to do reporting. And that model, as it began to collapse, you saw the New York Times and other prestige publications make a successful entrance into the subscription model. But the demographics that they're going for are very elite demographics, very educated, often urban, very wealthy. And in that whole process, in that same decade, you saw the rise of a very powerful ideology. We never know what to call it. We're not supposed to call it woke. I call it identitarian moralism. But in my view, the media was in some sense captured by this ideology. And so that's another stage of the trust.
Right. And the recent NPR piece and Free Press, lots of other people are sort of talking about this. But we focus on COVID a lot. I'm curious about this sort of transition from Trump to COVID, because that seems like in some ways COVID had this almost like Trumpian aura to it. And I'm wondering, like, did anything surprise you with the way that journalists in Canada responded to the pandemic? Or did you see it as a kind of a continuous decline, in a similar slope?
Looking back on it now, I would see it as a decline, and I would see all of these factors at play. But at the time, I found it all very surprising. I was working at that time at CBC. I was a current affairs radio producer on Toronto's Metro Morning, which is a flagship morning show in Toronto. And we did 2 stories a day every day as producers. And until that point, it was a real kind of mixed bag of shows. You might do arts, you might do
Mm.
sports, you might do all kinds of different stories. But then when the pandemic hit, I think we might have gone something like 300 days of doing COVID every
Really?
single day. And, you know, I, for 9/11, which would be the defining moment of my generation in terms of journalism, I was still in the student press for that. But colleagues of mine have said, you know, we covered that for 2 weeks straight. But none of us had ever covered a story for a year straight.
Wow.
It was a very destabilizing time, and I really, unfortunately, don't think that we handled it very well in the media.
And so was that pretty ubiquitous across Canada? You had these health reporters and other reporters that didn't have a health or science background, and they basically reported COVID for a year straight. Like this was an industry sort of reality.
Well, what we really need at this point in the industry now is we need a fulsome kind of review of what happened, and we don't have it.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so what we can talk about are trends in coverage, and we can talk about anecdotal
Right.
evidence, and we can talk
Yeah.
about particular examples, but we don't have a review where we
Yeah.
say we did 6 million stories. This
Right.
is, you know,
Right.
that's what we really, really need at this point.
Mm.
But in general terms, everybody was covering COVID all the time. You had a lot of
Yeah.
people who, as you say, did not have a background for this at all. And you had, for the first time, of course, remote work. And so people were
Right.
incredibly isolated. You
Right.
had really high levels of fear. And
Mm.
you can imagine, I mean, there was a great piece that came out during the pandemic called The COVID Reporters Are Not All Right. You can imagine the effects of
Mm.
doing a story like that,
Mm.
especially with the levels of panic that
Mm.
there was in
Yeah.
public health
Yeah.
over and over and over and over again. It would be very hard not to be swept up in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so all of that was going on, but of course there was also the groupthink going on that I've really talked about extensively in the press because I think
Mm.
it's it's very subtle, it's very
Mm.
insidious, and it's really really important that we get it to that for next time.
Right. And one of the factors of that is also, like you were saying, the business model. And so a lot of journalists are actually relying on Twitter or Facebook, whatever, for the stories that are driving, the clicks. And then of course we had massive censorship of those platforms during COVID. Uh,
Mm,
but kind of going back to your piece, so you have these, seven or whatnot sections, and one of
mhm,
them is titled "A Failure to Acknowledge Mistakes," and that's the one
mhm.
that you really talk about COVID in.
Yes.
So I'm just and so just kind of unpack that a little bit. Why do you think that that's so critical to COVID, or COVID is a good example to illustrate that point?
Well, when I left the CBC, the stories that were really the turning point for me, that the main story that was a turning point for me was the vaccine mandates. But I also mentioned in my letter the lockdowns and the school closures. Now, these are sweeping public policy that affect people's lives in incredibly important ways. And we really didn't see hardly any mainstream public debate about these policies at all.
Mm.
I remember right after I had left the CBC, the day that the truckers were driving across the country, I
Mm.
was interviewing Dion Polar about the vaccine mandates. That was the first really big critical piece that I had been able to do on those.
Mm.
And I was independent.
Who's Dion Polar, just for people who are not familiar?
Yeah, she's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, I believe, and
Mm.
she was one of the outspoken critics of the vaccine mandates during that
Mm.
period. And there were very few that were
Mm.
courageous enough to do that in public.
Mm.
There just wasn't any level of debate or discussion in the
Mm.
mainstream happening. And as you and I talked about when you came on the podcast, that there are serious questions that need to be
Mm.
asked about public policy like
Mm.
that. And
Mm.
I think that the role of a journalist is to be incredibly critical and skeptical and ask those questions on behalf of the public. The criticism that usually comes up within journalism is we're not experts. We, as I've already acknowledged, we didn't have the
Right.
background in science and public health and medicine, and that really it's not our job. But I think you can be critical. I think you can ask the questions. I think you can present many different viewpoints on an
Mm.
issue
Mm.
without being an expert.
Mm. So did once you quit the CBC and you did have this very public, sort of exit, did you get contacted by colleagues who maybe shared your opinion but weren't,
Yes.
able to, or didn't want to, or whatever their reasons were, and sort of like what were some of the most, I don't know, shocking or interesting conversations that you ended up having with colleagues?
Yes, I got contacted by a lot of colleagues, some that I knew and some that I did not across Canada and also across the US. There were a lot of people who agreed with what I was saying, but who, for various reasons, could not talk about it publicly. And I think we have to remember too, some people are in different situations. Some people
Yeah.
are single moms. Some people have very different situations in which they cannot risk their livelihoods. But in terms of the conversations that I was having, I wouldn't say that there was anything particularly shocking. And of course, the details I had to keep confidential because it was all off
Yeah,
the
of
record
course. Yeah,
conversations.
no,
But
right.
but I think there's a real general sense that it was a very stifling environment, that there was a real suppression of dissenting voices, and that it was really unhealthy for us as a society, but particularly during a health emergency and in a crisis, that this is the time that you most need to see science do what science does best, which is pit ideas against each other
Right.
and work out those ideas in public.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of behind the scenes, a lot of worry about the fact that that was not happening. And then, of course, people had different experiences too. I mean, the school closures was a really big deal here in Ontario. I think it
Right.
was something like 135 days that schools were closed. These were very long closures. And again, almost no public debate about that. Lockdowns in Toronto were some of the longest in the world. You just weren't, you could go online in 5 minutes and find very
Yes.
credible dissenting voices,
Right.
but they weren't cracking the mainstream. And I guess the question is, why not? And I think that for next time, we really need to be constantly asking ourselves, if we're really representing the debates, if we're actually asking ourselves all the time, what if we're wrong? Like, what if we're wrong? What if we're
Yeah.
wrong?
Yeah. I mean, you'd think that that's a core, normal, everyday process that happens in the newsroom, right? You have a red team, you have a dissenter that's sort of over there in the corner whose job it is to challenge the mainstream that's coming out. But that's clearly not the case, or there's elements of that have gone astray. There's so many different questions I could ask you, but thinking about the legacy of COVID
Mm.
going forward. So if we were to have another health emergency, another respiratory pandemic, in a year, let's say, do you think that the Canadian media would behave differently?
I don't know. I don't know. I would like to think that we would, but I'm not sure about that at this point. The problem is that we haven't had, in the States right now, you're having a kind of reckoning, although it's on a very small scale, you are having a reckoning with some of these big stories. You are having the New York Times come out and say the school closures were not effective in controlling the spread and really hurt marginalized students and had a big impact on education, with learning loss, and with mental health. But
Yeah.
we're not seeing that reckoning happening in this country in any kind of meaningful way. And that concerns me. And I just want to take one example. For example, if you recall, at some point in 2020, this is a very absurdist kind of example, but Theresa Tam came out and said, if you are a single person and you are dating and you are planning to have intercourse,
Right.
you should wear a mask
Right.
while you have intercourse. This was a totally ridiculous thing to say in public. We knew at the time that it was a ridiculous thing to say in public. And when I look back at that coverage, again, we need a systemic review. I'm sure there's exceptions to this, but when I look at the coverage of it, when I do a search online, there's no media outlet bringing in an expert to say, there's no way you can have intercourse with somebody in close
Yeah.
without a risk of spreading the virus. Wearing
Yeah.
a mask is a silly idea for this particular instance. So it's
Or,
those.
or at least a cloth mask is not, you should wear an N95 or, a face, one of those helmets or something. There's no, yeah, I get what you're saying.
But I'm just saying, like, these things do need to be revisited. We need to revisit the way that we handled the lab leak theory. We need to revisit the lockdowns. We need to revisit the school closures, because the public is still very angry about these stories, and for good reason. I don't think that we were as critical as we should have been. And so we need to have the kind of reckoning that is happening elsewhere in the world.
Right.
And until we do, I'm not convinced that we would handle this in any different way.
And that gets back to one of your early points that motivated the piece, which was the chasm that you were seeing between the public and the conversations that you have on your podcast or the comments, and then what the sort of media elite are thinking, right?
Hmm.
This huge global, really narrative around misinformation, right? And we need
Hmm.
better censorship laws, and that's the problem, right? Rather than
Mm.
actually people don't trust the media because, well, we're actually not doing our job properly. Um, I'm curious, who would conduct an evaluation of the media landscape in Canada? Like, what organization should, in a functioning or a stronger democracy, conduct such an evaluation?
I think that should fall to the CBC. There's really no other organization that is resourced in the way that the CBC is in this country. And the CBC is really this kind of still the central pillar of journalism in this country. It sets the standards. And I believe it really should do a comprehensive review of its own coverage and take a good, honest look. And particularly after 2020, I think we need to allow people some grace for the first portion of the pandemic. People were frightened. It was
Yeah.
an incredibly chaotic time. But particularly after sort of the fall of 2020, I think there should be a real critical look at how these stories were handled and why more viewpoints in particular were not folded into the coverage.
That's a great point. Well, so maybe the conservatives are talking about defunding the CBC, but maybe we should fund them for a proper evaluation, right? That could be a political talking point, maybe.
I
Anyhow,
think we still need the CBC. I really do. I have real hopes that they will reform.
okay, well, great. I think hopefully your essay is a path in the right direction. So thanks so much for joining me, Tara, and pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me on. Nice to see you again.